Welcome to University Place Presents. I'm Norman Gilliland. A civil war, a war of secession, a culture war, or simply a war of aggression by any name, on February 24th, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, a country that was independent, had been for some 30 years. What were the goals of the Russians, and in response to them, what was the goal of the Ukrainians? And how did it all come about? How avoidable were the tens of thousands of casualties, both military and civilian? With me is David McDonald, professor of history at the UW-Madison, and welcome back to University Place Presents.
Thanks, Norm. Great to be back.
One of the pictures we see most often in one form or another is the vast destruction in Ukraine. And what steps led up to this?
Well, Norman, a lot of steps led up to it, depending on when you want to start. But in the medium term, I would say if you want to see when the fuse was lit, you might go to 2004 with the Orange Revolution, so-called, that saw the sitting government, the elected government at the time, obliged to initiate a re-election in a very hotly contested electoral campaign, in which the losing candidate at first ultimately won, and put in President Putin a certain apprehension about the spread of so-called color revolutions. There was a Rose Revolution in Georgia, there was Cedar Revolution in Lebanon, there were various revolutions in the former Yugoslavia, violent overthrows of power, the same in Kyrgyzstan of all places. And but Ukraine was particularly sensitive, and I think you can start tracing Putin's specific thought towards Ukraine to those events in 2004.
Quite a contrast, though, between, let's say, the planners of these two wars.
Oh, very much so. We know, or we've got a pretty good idea that the Russians and a great many of us in the West and elsewhere around the world expected a pretty easy victory for Russian forces, which after all seemed to outnumber them, seemed to have much more ordnance at their disposal than the Ukrainian army. I think people did not take the Ukrainian armed forces very seriously. There were serious differences in access to air power and to certain types of defense. And then this column, whose officers, the armored column going along the road from Kharkiv to Kiev, or from south of Kharkiv to Kiev, they found themselves bogged down in a version of what Russians call the Rasputia, that the roads dissolve under the thaw and the rain in the late winter. And these forces, whose officers had been told to pack their dress uniforms for the handover ceremony in Kiev, or Kiev, and a victory parade, all of a sudden found themselves stranded and actually targets for a pot shooting expedition by Ukrainian militias and regular forces.
And if we just look at the planners themselves, the contrast there between, the well-dressed, well-heeled military uniform on the one hand, and then Zelensky, whom we've never seen outside of basically fatigues.
Fatigues, yes, who's also speaking to his countrymen every night. No, with the planners, again, since this initial stalemate in the conflict, we start seeing potshots from both above and below at these planners. The head of the Wagner group, this guy named Prigozhin, lavishes public criticism on the defense minister Shoigu. There's a lot of evidence that Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin himself took sole charge of figuring out the strategy of the attack. And in Ukraine, they've tended to try and maximize what strategic or tactical superiorities they have, plus knowing the territory, knowing post-Soviet tactics, and having received a good deal of training from their NATO friends. So it's an interesting contrast in capabilities and in resolve.
Before we go back in time and look at kind of the development, let's say, of Ukrainian national identity, a little bit about Zelensky.
Yeah, sure.
Native speaker of Ukrainian?
Yeah, he's from. There are large parts of Ukraine that are originally Russian-speaking. We know Donbass best, but if you go down the area immediately south of that, between Donbass and the Crimea. It's called New Russia, and it was settled by peasants, many of whom identify as Russian and as Orthodox. So even when you're listening to NPR or BBC or CBC broadcasts of refugees from the area, you'll often hear Russian-speaking locals who are swearing at Russian citizens and Russian soldiers for the atrocities they say they're committing. So no, there's not a unitary Ukrainophone population in the borders of Ukraine, and yet. Thinking what were they planning or what were they hoping for, I think there was a strong expectation in Moscow that these people would embrace liberation from fellow members of what Putin has called the Russian world. Instead, and they saw a grievously divided country, they've all come together, and under this figure, Zelensky, who most people know as the lead figure in a very popular TV series called Servant of the People. And he runs for, and it's sort of like the same reactions that Ronald Reagan got when he first ran for president. And he turns out, actually, people who in audiences I've spoken to who know more about these things or have paid a lot more attention than I have, I confess to these things, they referred me to sources that demonstrate quite persuasively. This was a very capable businessman who ran a quite well-developed business empire, entertainment empire, and he's used to managing complex problems, and he's shown himself remarkably adaptable to and adept at the role he's been asked to play. And he has done a very good job, very powerful job, mobilizing not only the Ukrainian population, despite its own divisions, less real in some aspects than might have seemed to President Putin, but he's also persuaded Western powers to back his cause, despite certain amounts of hesitation, whether it's from parts of American political spectrum, Germans who are very reluctant to reclaim a certain identity that is a stain upon their historical past. But to me, the most striking things are Finland and Sweden asking to join NATO. And Sweden especially, neutral at great cost since 1815, and Finland, which had been enjoined to neutrality by a treaty in 1955 to afford the Soviets a buffer.
But of course, Finland did have a history with Russia.
They had
an invasion in the 30s.
Well, not just the 30s. They'd been
that.
a province. So the Grand Duchy of Finland had been brought in is a very nice way of putting it, into the Russian Empire by Alexander I in 1809. And they'd been allowed to function under their own laws and under a governor general until 1917, when the empire falls apart and they gradually win their independence. But even then, they had grown to know the Russians. The Finnish president had very friendly relations with Putin, and that's all gone. Like, I mean, that's you see when I've always jibbed at the idea of the West. Because I think it's a sort of black box way of talking about an area that's very diverse.
Yes.
But in this instance, it's amazing how quickly a NATO that we once thought was fractured has pulled together. And how, to a surprisingly large extent, given the polarized state of American politics, how strong support still is for the assistance and considerable assistance being rendered to Ukraine.
One of the mileposts along the way, I'm guessing, as to how this war came to be, Putin's miscalculations.
It's a continuation of a long history of miscalculations that I think from the Russian point of view, there's been a way of looking at Ukraine, well, in a way that Vladimir Putin put it last summer, saying that along with Belarus, Ukraine really is an indivisible part of Russian statehood and Russian identity. And the word in Russian you can use, there's an old Russian word, adjective for the empire, and you see it in some Soviet titles as well, Rossiyskiy as opposed to Ruski, which means an ethnic Russian. Rossiyskiy just refers to a citizen or subject of a Russian state, or of a great Russian state. And Putin's view, which actually echoes set of arguments made in a series of speeches by Alexander Solzhenitsyn when he returned to Russia after 1991, is that Russia and Belarus and Ukraine share 1,000 years of heritage, share a religious legacy, share all sorts of cultural touchstones, whether it's Nikolai Gogol or other authors that are part of the Russian literary canon, and that their differences are very minor. Now, Ukrainians will argue in turn that they've been arguing since before the 19th century, but with particular effect since the 19th century, that they constitute a discrete national culture that has certain affinities with the Russian culture, but is not the same. And we see this put forth by the great poet Taras Shevchenko.
Certain spokesmen for that cause here
Yes.
that we're seeing.
Yeah, and just like a lot of societies in Eastern Europe, I can think of historians in the Czech, in what we now call the Czech Republic, or in Slovakia, or Yugoslavia. These guys, Mykola Kostomarov and Mikhail Drahomanov and Grigory Hrushevsky, argue that Ukraine has a separate tradition, its people have a separate consciousness, and implicitly they deserve to form their own nation state, which they did momentarily under the chaotic conditions of the civil war after the Bolshevik Revolution, and then they disappear as a nation, as that kind of nation in the early 20s.
But along the way, presumably there were Russian, Soviet, if you want to call it that, efforts to Sovietize, Russify Ukraine.
Oh, very much. We say under the Russian Empire, Alexander II issues an Ems decree, which bans the use of Ukrainian in certain settings and refuses to recognize Ukrainian as a language. In the late 1920s, as Stalin was establishing his control over the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, there becomes great concern over incipient Ukrainian separatism or overemphasis on Ukrainian nationality at the cost of Soviet patriotism, and so they de-Ukrainize the party, which is a euphemism for all sorts of other things. And we see the elevation of Russian speakers to high positions in the party. But for Ukrainians, they will focus on the Holodomor and what they consider the systematic and genocidal starvation of Ukrainian peasants during the collectivization campaigns of the early 1930s at a cost of millions of lives and horrible, horrible incidents in the forced collectivization of Ukrainian agriculture.
Was that collectivization under Stalin primarily?
Yeah,
and
exclusively.
was that essentially an ethnic arrangement, or were Russians affected in great numbers also?
I think in Ukraine it was particularly focused, and a lot of historians will argue that it was ethnic. When I look at but they're elsewhere in the Soviet Union that they experienced similar deprivation or certain want, but not the same loss of life, but the North Caucasus, Western Siberia, and Kazakhstan, where there was a natural certain natural conditions combined to bring famine to a nomadic population, the livestock on which they depended. But Ukraine, it resonated with particular force, certainly stronger than Kazakhstan, and a particular force sustained by a diaspora that coalesced after World War II to maintain and commemorate that what they consider that atrocity.
We'll look at that diaspora a little bit later. How similar are the languages, Russian and Ukrainian? Mutually intelligible?
Mostly mutually intelligible. They all can, you'll hear more Russian spoken in Ukraine simply because Russian was the language of education for generations in Ukraine. They used the word Russification before. Another policy that dates to imperial times. Historians dispute what that actually means, but there's no question there was a strong consensus among Russian-educated classes that Russian was the language of educated exchange, was the language of the academy. It was the only international language, despite evidence from various other diasporas in the Soviet population. But it certainly was the language of advancement in the party and all the other meaningful institutions. So. It was pretty easy to think of Ukraine. You didn't have to meet the problem of mutual intelligibility. I know when I took Russian at school in Canada and university, a lot of my friends were Ukrainians who went into it thinking it would be a dawdle because they're so close, and they found out how distant the two languages are. And so you get, you get more of an overlap than English does with Dutch or German, but more like Spanish and French.
Really? So still pretty distant.
Yeah, yeah.
Let's look at a map, and that'll give us some
Yeah.
idea of how Ukraine as a current entity was pieced together. What are we looking at?
Well, what we now call Ukraine starts off as and a lot of this Putin writes this essay in the summer of 2022. Putin has people write it probably, and he wants to talk about the deep historical continuities between congeries of city-states we call Kiev Rus, because Kiev was the capital. Rus was the name that the territory and the people acquire in the chronicle we use to understand what was going on then. But it was actually a string of towns that grew up on the Dnieper or the Dnipro River on what they call the road from the Varangians, Vikings in the north, to the Greeks, which is Byzantium, the Constantinople, and Viking mini dynasties set themselves up in these towns at the quote-unquote invitation of the populations, or the chronicle insists, and they're all mutually related, and it's they who accept Christianity, and so we see the Orthodox Church establishes an extremely important part of East Slavic, we can say, culture, and then after about 1200, 1300, well, we get the Mongol invasions in the 1230s, and it has an incredible effect on the states in the areas. Kiev falls on the edge, or Kiev falls on the edge of Mongol control, which is really focused on north-central Russia. Now, Russian historians in the 19th century will tell us, well, we can tell by the appearance in the chronicle of all these new cities, there's a huge northern migration out of the dangers of the prairie, the steppe, and into the protection of the forested area and the protection of these increasingly powerful princes. We do know that the old Silk Road, which used to go along the north shore of the Black Sea, and that tends to wither. Trade goes until the Mongols establish strong control, and we see trade go on a maritime basis under South Asia and into the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, or goes north along the Volga route and into the Baltic. And but they posit this mass migration, and that's how Ukrainians become Russians. But there's more and more evidence to suggest no, it wasn't like that. But the southern prairie becomes the playground for groups called Cossacks, who are freebooters, but also do farming and also have peasants. And what we think of as modern Ukraine starts taking shape among these bands who profess orthodoxy, but also sell their services to the King of Poland as border guards, or the Muscovite Tsar as border guards, or make their own living plundering caravans as they go along the way in the hunting season.
So really a very cosmopolitan hunk of geography that is
Oh, sure. Yeah,
Ukraine
even
today.
Even at the time, those areas become borderlands. It's those in your audience who've read Richard White on the borderlands area around the lakehead of Lake Superior and all the cultures that overlap and intermix there. This is an original and very long-lived borderlands that only starts to take different shape as Poland, Russia, Muscovite Russia, and the Ottoman Empire advance into this vacuum, doing what power does when it confronts a vacuum. But these Cossacks form a really important role in the crystallization of what comes to be remembered as Ukrainian distinctness. And so we get a series of hetmani. The hetman are the warlords. You get Bogdan Khmelnytsky, who enjoys the rights of a Polish nobleman for selling his, and there's a list of Cossack officers who get treated as noble in Polish law. But he leads a revolt against the Poles for many reasons, including the Poles want him to convert to Catholicism. And it's in the 17th century. It's the height of what we call the counter of the Catholic Reformation. And Khmelnytsky's not going to do it. Plus, the Cossacks prize their independence. And so Khmelnytsky concludes, in order to get out from Polish pressure, Cossacks in Khmelnytsky's area conclude an agreement with representatives of the Muscovite Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, and they agree to accept his protection. But on the condition that they maintain their autonomy, they conduct their own foreign policy, they rule themselves by their own laws, but they will do what the Tsar's bidding. Well, when you're talking to an absolute ruler who's divinely ordained,
It's hard to make a compromise.
yeah, and drawing lines is hard, and getting people to accept agreements is hard, and it suits the Muscovites fine. Now, they're not being cynical. I think it's just a clash of mutual understandings and assumptions. The Cossacks are thinking like Polish noblemen and like Cossacks, and the Muscovites are thinking like Muscovites, and because orthodoxy is key to them. So by the late 17th century, the Muscovy, soon to be Imperial Russia, has already abrogated a lot of these agreements in the eyes of the Cossacks, but in exchange has given the Cossacks in its service the same type of privilege that nobles elsewhere in Russia would enjoy. Not quite like Polish rights, but still. But there's still a lot of ill feeling. So Ivan Mazepa, a Cossack leader and an intimate of Peter the Great's, betrays Peter in the course of the Great Northern War against Sweden by switching to the side of the Swedish king, who has promised him the ability to create an independent state. And he loses out at the epic Battle of Poltava, crosses into Poland, and there has his court publish a Codex Ruthenorum, the Code of the Ruthenians, and it's for a Ukrainian state.
So that's really the genesis of this concept of Ukraine.
Certainly, many modern historians would say so. It's hard to say because a lot of Ukrainians at the time, especially from Kiev, which goes into the Russian Empire, or the Muscovy in the late 17th century, we see a striking migration of senior clerics, Orthodox clerics, from Kiev, but unlike their Russian counterparts, they've been in contact with neighboring Polish Jesuits. Feofan Prokopovich has gone to study in Rome and has studied a lot of German Protestant seminaries and comes to Russia and under Peter reforms the Orthodox Church quite radically for the time, taking German Lutheran state churches as model. There's a memoir by a noble from the time who notes that, he's a disgraced noble who's writing his memoirs, and he notes that when he went to school in St. Petersburg, people made fun of his accent, because Ukrainians, even when they speak Russian, and Khrushchev and Brezhnev have the same accent, they have a lot of sounds that are like Ukrainian sounds. The way they say certain vowels, the way they pronounce gia is ha, and they would always call him Hoko, which is the top knot that the Ukrainian Cossacks had. So there is some sense of their difference. As late as the 1760s, and the Commission Catherine the Great convenes, we see Cossack leaders who were good nobles and loyal nobles asking to be re-granted the rights their grandfathers had enjoyed under the Agreement of Pereyaslav. They want to recreate something, but it's unclear whether they want to be independent or whether they want to be autonomous within a Russian state.
What is Little Russia?
That's certainly to a lot of Ukrainians, and certainly to a lot of Ukrainians abroad, Little Russia is seen as a derogatory term that sort of scants any claim to any type of identity for Ukrainians. Part of me wants also to suggest that it's a way of talking about there's Velikaya Russia, which is Great Russia, and Great Russians, Velika Rossi, are people who live in Great Russia. It's territorial. Belarus is White Russia. It's just like Lower New Jersey. And, I'm not saying it's like, I'm just saying it's using a designation like that. And Mala Russia, I think that a lot of people interpret it as just a little Russia. It's not like little Korea or little Scotland or whatever. It's just a way of it's purely geographical. Just like the area to the south, New Russia, which modern day Russian nationalists and separatists have made great hay with. New Russia was itself just an area for it's like Nova Scotia, New Scotland, right, or New Zealand. These are just territories that were seen as terras nullius and were settled by inhabitants from other parts of the empire as newly prized territory. So I think people overreact to Mala Russia, but I'm not one of the people overreacting or reacting, so they might argue otherwise.
As we get into the late 19th, into the early 20th century, into the Russian Revolution, the Russian Civil War, and all of that, how does Ukraine play?
Well, there's lots of Ukraines. coming out of 1905, when the idea of Ukraine seems possible, there are those who just want greater national autonomy within the Russian Empire, but they'd like a constitutional democracy as well. There are others who are socialists and want to ally with the Bolsheviki. There are others who see themselves as Mensheviks. There's a large population that doesn't really care. They just want to be able to eat. One of the striking features that I think we often lose sight of is that with a lot of these nationalisms under empire, we get conflicting visions of what it ought to be. Some visions of Ukrainianism are quite anti-Semitic. Others are very cosmopolitan, inclusive, and federalist. So, and we see a lot of that create the tensions that make Ukraine more vulnerable during the Civil War. But they do manage to gain recognitions from the German and Austro-Hungarian governments at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in the spring of 1918, and
an attempt maybe to break off some of the Russian Empire.
Partly that, partly
favor?
because they had a lot of food. They were the Ukrainian, lots of grain, and the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians desperately needed it, and were willing to. And there was possibility of getting territory, and there was possibility of getting access to the Black Sea. So there were a lot of strategic benefits that Ukraine offered, but with the ultimate defeat of the Central Powers by November 1918, or they would say their ceasefire, Ukraine becomes very vulnerable and very divided. You've got warlords in the south. You've got Cossack independent operators. You've got about 4 different changes of government in a quick period of time, and huge vulnerability against a much larger and better equipped Red Army.
Ukraine's involvement in the war as part of the Soviet state, but under what terms did Ukraine actually become part of the Soviet Union?
The Bolsheviks finally argue militarily and successfully that they'll recognize Ukraine national identity, but socialists do not become bourgeois nationalists. So they want to be in solidarity with their neighboring socialists and right-thinking people.
International movement.
And they find people in Ukrainian politics who agree with them, and so the Soviets, having conquered other parts, or reintegrated, they would say, other parts of Russia and Sovietized them, Ukraine becomes also part of the Soviet Union, in the course of which they find attached to them new provinces in the east, the Donbass and Kharkiv, and which have tremendous economic advantages, the iron and the steel industry, the coal mining industry. The map shows that we only see, interestingly, the most militant area source for Ukrainian nationalism, which we recognize it, was only part of Ukraine as of 1939 and 45, and they stay after, is Galicia, Halicizna, which had been Austro-Hungarian province, a city we call Lviv now, or Lvov in Polish, or Lvov in Russian, or Lemberg or Leopolis in German. It was really a province of Habsburg Poland, but was also an area where the Habsburg government encouraged Ukrainian nationalist writers to produce materials and send them into Russia. But Khrushchevsky lives in Lviv, and there are a series of very famous intellectuals and writers in Lviv that gained big followings in Ukraine. They only joined in Second World War as a result of the Nazi-Soviet pact, in part, and they become, under the Soviets, the biggest thorn in the Soviet side in terms of Ukrainian nationalism. There's a very good historian at the the University of Georgia who's written on this, and has become the Lvov under Lviv under the Soviets has become a real source of interest among modern historians of Ukraine.
So Ukrainians during World War II were not that invested in the Soviet cause?
It depends who you're asking, because there are many types of Ukrainians. Obviously, there was a large Ukrainian Jewish population, and they suffer enormously. They're one of the most concentrated sites of Holocaust victims in the Jewish population of Europe. Others, and it's become a bone of contention, and a pretext in the current war, others side with the Nazis and form regiments to fight on the side of the Nazis, or join the SS and enjoy notorious roles as camp guards, and often particularly brutal. They defend themselves by saying the Nazis are awful, but they're not as bad as Stalin.
So there actually is an argument, as we jump forward just for a moment,
Yes.
for characterizing Ukraine almost any way you want, from democracy-loving to Nazi-inclined.
Absolutely. Well, you were mentioning earlier how it had this crossroads aspect that goes back to the Middle Ages or late antiquity, and one might argue that this is a continuing reflection of it, that there are all sorts of currents, political, intellectual, religious, right? That aside from Judaism, there's a small Muslim population. There's a huge conflict, religious and institutional, between what the newspapers call Greek Catholic, but say where I grew up in Canada, we would say Ukrainian Catholic or Ukrainian or Greek or Russian Orthodox churches, and involves property, involves liturgy, it involves allegiances, involves identities, and yet on one level they'll all agree, yes, we're Ukrainians, but then when it gets down to cases, then you see differences. And we see this most distinctly. One of the oldest monasteries in Orthodox Christianity in the East Slavs is the Pechorskaya Lavra in Kiev, and it turns out a lot of the monks there are pro-Russian, and the state is trying to find ways to crack down on them.
You mentioned earlier both Khrushchev and Brezhnev.
Yeah.
Were they ethnic Ukrainian, or were they from the Russian part of Ukraine?
They're actually born in Russia, but from the 1880s on, the work is in the Don Basin. And so, but then you get assimilated into local culture, and Khrushchev, he gives deeds Crimea to Ukraine because he feels a loyalty. He'd come up in the Ukrainian Communist Party. He spoke Ukrainian. It wasn't his native language, but he was born in a Russian family. But he identified with. That's where he'd spent World War II, which was the baptism by fire from a lot of the ones who had survived the purges. This was their baptism by fire, and Brezhnev. It's hard to say what Brezhnev felt, especially late in his life. I don't even think he knew what he felt, but he certainly identifies with the area. It's seen as one of the great cradles of the Bolshevik Party and its growth during the 1920s, because these are working class kids who made it big in the party.
With Khrushchev deeding, I guess would be the word, Crimea to Ukraine.
Yeah.
Didn't really matter, did it, if you go on the assumption that it's all part of the Soviet Union?
Precisely, and it's one of the this another element in an argument that Putin uses, that why do we consider, we all considered the communists, you Westerners and I both thought the communists were daft and illegitimate, but for some reason we take borders that they drew more seriously than the borders that should have existed, and why are you defending those borders? And it's not a totally irrefutable argument, but it's got its own opportunistic strain in it as well. But it's not an unreasonable thing to at least draw to people's attention. On the Nazi charge, definitely in some of the later demonstrations, particularly in the Maidan in 13 and 14, we see brigades named after the collaborationist leaders in the Ukrainian underground during World War II, the pro-Nazi underground. But it's very hard to believe there was more than 7% of the activists involved belonging to these brigades.
Ukraine, during the Cold War, as part of the Soviet Union, got nuclear weapons.
Yes, they had them. They had weapons stationed on their territory. And as in the case of, it's really hard to figure out what their national status was, except de facto, the finders keepers rule kicked in, or possession is 9/10 of the law. These missiles were stationed on Ukrainian territory, as were some on Kazakhstani territory and other former republics. And the Western Allies, particularly the United Kingdom and Great Britain, joined with the post-Soviet Russian government to in a document called the Budapest Memorandum, in which Ukraine will oblige itself to surrender its nuclear weapons in return for British and American assurances that they would defend their territory. Now, some people interpreted that as guarantee. I did until I went back and looked at it more closely. There is no mechanism for the enforcement of the agreement or the violation of sovereignty in that is mentioned in the agreement, the sanctity of sovereignty and territorial boundaries, and that Russia obliged itself to accept that. But there's no mechanism for actions should Russia, in some case, decide to ignore that provision. And at the time, and I confronted this as a historian of Russia, giving a lot of public speeches to audiences from Wisconsin and around the country, and the one refrain would be, well, who cares about Russia anymore? Russia's a done deal.
Yeah,
and
a little bit of a miscalculation there.
Well, and I think Allied diplomats might have made a miscalculation. They didn't appear on their actuarial chart as a possibility. And
which side was it? Was it the Gorbachev side, or was it the Western side that made that provision about giving up the nuclear weapons?
This wasn't even Gorbachev anymore. This was the Yeltsin government, and I think the West was concerned about rogue nukes. Again, there were concerns about growing terrorism. There were huge concerns about all this nuclear ordnance lying around with very
Little
iffy control, and the knowledge of a growing underground black market and any kind of contraband weaponry. So I think there was serious concern. The concern was with the nukes, and Russia was seen as the custodian of them because they had the expertise and they had the facilities, and the Russian government had acceded to a set of inspection protocols that were far more rigorous than anything that had been possible during the Cold War. So I think the Allies took some solace in that, but when we see what happens with Crimea, or we see what happens with other areas, or Donbass after 2014, it makes the Budapest Agreement look a little bit naive. Although the big result was undeniably that you eliminated a large part of a potential threat of nuclear proliferation.
Would Russia have invaded Ukraine if those nukes were still there?
That's a good question. The counterfactual like that, part of me wants to say Ukraine had so many other preoccupations during those years, they wouldn't have had the time to maintain the weapons. They might have become non-functional. I don't think that's why Putin did invade. I think it was more the type of society that Ukraine was becoming and how it clashed with his vision of what Russia should become in the context of a changing global security situation. So,
I wanted to look at this headline, though, because it did seem to be a real historical turning point, didn't it?
It was surprising that I think a lot of Russians thought of Ukraine as true blue, and then they have a referendum on whether or not Ukrainians want to be independent of the Soviet Union. Over 90% vote yes. So that means a lot of Russophone Ukrainians as well. And a lot of Russians would have thought that they would have found it inconceivable that the Soviet Union could collapse, or even that that you'd need a passport to go see your relatives in Ukraine. And like 20-25% of Russian Ukrainian families have relatives on the other side. During the war, we've heard instances of relatives and dear friends on either side of the border cutting each other off because they were believing the people living in Russia refused to believe that Ukraine had any legitimacy in the stance they were taking in the war.
I imagine it has gotten a lot more since.
Hard to say. Very hard to say. I imagine a lot of rural Russia, yes, it's become almost irreversible. But in urban Russia, it's hard to say. People have reverted to older habits about public expression.
I wanted to get back to this diaspora that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
What role have they played in information or in this war in general?
I think a neglected role. I think first and only time I was in Kiev, as we would have said then, or Kyiv is now, was in 1975. I was studying on an American program at Leningrad State University, and part of our curriculum involved a trip around the Soviet Union. We'd go to cities in the Baltic, but this trip went to Kiev, and then went to Tbilisi, capital of the Republic of Georgia, and I was struck. I was the only Canadian in this group, and I'm walking down the streets, and there's a big main street in Kiev called the Khreshchatyk, and it's being restored after World War II by the first Secretary Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev. And everywhere I'm looking, kids are wearing what we'd call toques, or ski hats, or beanies, with the logo of the Winnipeg Jets. And I'm seeing scarves with Jets logos. And I'm seeing University of Winnipeg and University of Alberta sweatshirts on people. And this was all clothes. Well, the Winnipeg Jets weren't even in the NHL yet. They were part of the WHA, the World Hockey Association. But there were close ties. The first Russian speakers I met in my hometown in Saskatchewan were Ukrainian and Jewish relatives come over on special passports for a quick visit with their relations in Canada. So this diaspora, they saw themselves as custodians of what they would call true Ukrainian culture and true Ukrainian values and religiosity and the rest of it, and language. In university institutes, certainly across Canada, in Pennsylvania, at Harvard, in areas of the Midwest, and on the West Coast, but also in Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and other areas of Western and Central Europe. And I think they saw themselves as keepers of the flyer. And then when things loosen up with the independence after 91, we see a lot of them either return or go, do their own version of making Aliyah and get involved in Ukrainian life. And there's been a lot of Ukrainian Canadians killed in the action in defense of the new Republic. But I also think, say, in things like the Orange Revolution in 2004, they provide tremendous support with money and there are a lot of political advisors. 2004 is really interesting because this is where we see just how mobilized Ukrainian civil society is. And throughout most of the old Soviet states, you get the odd demonstration. I do work in Kazakhstan, and there were a lot of demonstrations and violent protests there a year ago, January, and they're still resonating. But here, like since 1991, this population has gone to the streets to ask for a government that is not corrupt. They've been very powerful voters. And yet, 2004 was over this contested election between Viktor Yushchenko and our friend Yanukovych. There were police agents who oversaw poisoning of Yushchenko, and he had to be hospitalized. You remember his face was disfigured.
Yes.
And he had lost, and people went to this Maidan Nezalezhnosti, Independence Square, and demonstrated to the extent that the government and the president of Ukraine had to call a new election that Yushchenko and his ally at the time, Timoshenko, they won. And Yanukovych, who represented the Party of the Regions, which was seen as pro-Russian, makes his retreat. Well, the Yushchenko government goes down in disgrace, and Yanukovych comes to power again in 2010, as I recall. And at the time, there's a debate whether Ukraine's going to orient to the West.
East or West, yeah.
Or the West. Well, this is occurring in a different context as well. The Russian situation has become very complex with a series of incidents, terrorist challenges to Putin's authority, the school massacre in Beslan, the hostage-taking at the Nordost play in a Moscow theater, hundreds of casualties in both, some would argue through a mishandling by Russian security forces. But most notably in 2007, Vladimir Putin makes a speech. Now, let's remember, Putin is the first foreign leader to contact President Bush the Younger, in 2001 after the Twin Towers attack,
yes.
And the Pentagon and the plane in Pennsylvania, to say, we know what you're going through. We've been going through this for 10 years. And there's been several waves of they believe Chechen-initiated terrorist bombings in Moscow, St. Petersburg, major Russian cities. And so Putin, and the then President Bush said he could tell Putin was a man of spirit and conviction because you could see it in his eyes, right?
You can see his soul, yes.
Yeah, and
Putin said, what's that?
or I can see Paris from here. But we see gradual chilling, right? Putin turns on a lot of the domestic oligarchs, most notably Mikhail Khodorkovsky, but then starts becoming itchy about territorial threats from the growing expansion of NATO, and makes a speech at this annual conference in Munich saying, you guys got to quit. U.S. is not the only great power in the world. You've got to quit acting so unilaterally. We're getting impatient. You're not respecting our interests. You didn't in the former Yugoslavia. There are areas of the map that we consider traditional spheres of interest, and you're showing us no respect. Right?
Interest and buffer zones, too.
Yeah, precisely.
From attack from the West.
Well, from the Russian point of view.
Before,
now,
yeah.
regardless of the fact that NATO is a defensive alliance,
Well, yes.
right? Action is only coordinated action only occurs in response to an attack on a member state.
Right.
And then 2008, this war with Georgia. There's arguments both ways that are equally plausible, but in response to what he considers Georgian provocation, they invade and keep some of the territories they've occupied and declare them independent.
We start to see this pattern then.
Well, this is the script for 2014.
Yes,
yeah.
for taking back Crimea.
And so Yanukovych government in place after 2010, and a deeply divided Ukraine, it would appear. There's been vague promises one way or the other that the EU has reached out to Ukraine and said, do you want most favored nation status, and we'll support you in that. And there's a lot to be said for that, because Ukraine's got very heavy debts. They've got a very uneven economy.
Yes.
They're worried about corruption, but the Russians and the Putin government says, and I think it's the Medvedev government by this time, because they're doing the castling maneuver.
Yes.
Putin had to step
Swapping
down.
back and forth.
That's right. And the Russians say, no, you stay with us, we'll make it worth your while. And Yanukovych, well, should I go this way or that way? And he goes with the Russians. And there we see, now 2004 occurred in a wave of colored revolutions, most of which rapidly subsided, not unlike the Arab Spring several years later.
Right.
Here, and it's late 2013, we see people gather, many, many more than had been the case in 2004, and we see people gathering.
We look here, yes, this does give you some idea of the magnitude of that
and
gathering.
They just cover the whole Independence place, and as things go on, they develop their own support infrastructure, and we see people from all over Ukraine and even the diaspora come in. We also see these different right-wing forces, militias that have been around. Once special police start firing on them, they turn on them. And it turns into a successful revolution that overthrows the Yanukovych government, and he's replaced by subsequent elections. And Yanukovych flees to Rostov-on-Don, a big city southeast of where they are. And that becomes his place. He becomes a one-man government in exile, while we learn all about the lavish benefits he conferred on himself and his family and his friends while in power. Like, I'd like a 3-hole golf course on my property, but fill those idle hours.
You retired too early.
And then what? We sit through the Olympics. This is all going on. And the Sochi Olympics turn out to be a probable success, especially if you're a Canadian male hockey fan. But it seemed like everything was all evened up. And then all of a sudden, we see reports from Crimea of these quote-unquote little green men that dress exactly like Russian soldiers, are very polite. And the fact is, the Crimean Peninsula is largely Russian, or else Crimean Tatar, a descent of people who'd fought in the Mongol armies. And all of a sudden, we see this creeping takeover, and that map does a very good job of showing what's going on, how gradually it is. And then they have a referendum, and like many of these referenda, whether right-wing or left-wing over the centuries, the winners want to overstate their victory. And my hunch would be, given all the naval veterans, like the biggest naval base for the Soviet Navy in the Black Sea was in Sevastopol, a city on the Crimea, that they leased from the Ukrainian government. And going back to Soviet times, right, because this had been an epic battlefield in World War II, and the defense of Sevastopol had been really, well, and the Soviets had sunk billions of rubles, even inflated rubles, into this facility. That summer, I'm giving lectures on a cruise on the Volga, and a Wisconsin alumni, a couple other schools, a couple guys from the Naval Academy, and one of them gets up and says, "I don't know what the big fuss is about. Like, how could you not think this was going to happen? This is the strategic Soviet, post-Soviet naval base, and you think they're going to give it up just because? And do you think they trust the Ukrainians to lease it to them? No, and they're guarding an asset. And whatever you think of, but it does come at the cost of violating the sovereignty of a state that it formed part of, right? So
yeah, even though that particular sovereignty was only about 30 years old.
Well, it's actually 50, but yeah, but that's numbers. Yeah, no, and one can make arguments both sides. But the other thing is, we see the spring up, just like with these little green men. It's little green men with worse tempers in the Donbass, and start setting up people's governments and flying red banners and that. And the same in Transnistria on the Moldovan border. We see it reasserted, long being this outlaw Soviet or post-Soviet enclave, and we see action starting there. And then we see this sort of, it's not the fake, what they call the, 1940, the false war, that
phony war.
Phony war.
Yeah, right.
But it's not phony, and there's certainly military action, but it's a stalemate and it's low key. And we see growing divisions and hardening on both sides. That in Ukraine, radical de-Russification, getting rid of all artifacts of Russian rule. They would say not unlike what went on in the South with these statues of the Confederate. And we see Pushkin. Catherine oversaw the incorporation of Ukraine into the Russian Empire.
Pushkin, just a poet, but
Pushkin
the
was a
Russian
poet, yeah.
national poet.
Yeah, precisely. And then Holodomor receives ever greater emphasis. Whereas on the Russian side, there's almost an isomeric quality to it. That Putin has a statue built of Vladimir, Saint Volodymyr, as the Ukrainians would call him, who had brought Christianity, he would claim, to Russia.
Common culture.
And this is the common culture that makes Russia and Ukraine and Belarus all indivisible. And then after Crimea, Putin had been sagging in the polls. He'd faced huge opposition in 2012 in demonstrations in Bolotnaya Square. And it was already starting to become very alive to the possibility of a coalescence of the opposition. And then, so we see a celebration of the annexation of Crimea and the proliferation of these quote-unquote George Crosses, service medals from World War II. This is a memory that always comes into play in backing Russia and supporting Russia. It's the one moment that the people can claim as their history. At the same time,
A success story.
the success story. They would consider it the only legitimate success story in World War II, since they saved the West that seemed to have forgotten the favor and pushed them back. And so what we see over the next years is Putin seeing the accumulation of nested opportunities, I think the way you could put it, and just inviting him, right? There's ongoing resistance in Donbass. Ukraine goes through a series of presidents, including Petro Poroshenko, who had made his money selling chocolate to Russian consumers, but showed surprising firmness vis-a-vis Russia in relation to Crimea and Donbass. But he's elected out of office because of perceptions of corruption by this Volodymyr Zelensky. Jewish, Russian-speaking, comedian, an entertainer, and he says he's going to take a softer line. Putin underestimates him, and at least these attacks, and boom, and here we are, right? And what's Putin? What else gave Putin a sense of opportunity? The divisions in the EU, and then the period of the Trump administration in the United States, where now the Obama administration didn't shine. They called Russia a second-class power. You never call a former great power second class. and that their ambassador at the time did not do them any favors, took active part in Russian politics. I don't think that's a diplomat's job. His job is to report and to lobby. And so there was a lot of abraded nerves in Moscow to begin with, but then we see the divisions that set in American politics and in British politics with Brexit.
Looked like a big opportunity. The West was apparently falling apart.
Yes. And so there's a joke I could say, but I won't, but that how could you not act, especially because he could say there were Nazis in the, and so this was not a war. This was a technical military operation to replace the Ukrainian government, which had permitted in its midst unforgivable presence of Nazi extremists. And here we are. We get destruction starting on a really a scale that had not occurred since World War II in Europe. Breadth, something like 20% of the population displaced, whether abroad, in Canada, United States, or West.
Like 44 million.
Out of 44 million, exactly.
Yeah,
We're talking awfully large number of people. And you look in papers in Britain, you look in papers in parts of the States, certainly in my home area in Canada, it's all stories about Ukrainian refugees.
Sure.
BBC's doing features of them on the radio. And they have all united. A country that was terribly divided has united strongly behind Zelensky. Again, as I said earlier, as has NATO, a NATO that is now bigger,
Yes.
Bigger by two formerly neutral countries. Switzerland has been contributing to support for weapons.
Have they?
Like, go figure. They won't say where the funds are coming from, but
They have accounts.
Yeah, yeah, they've got friends in Zurich. But the United States has contributed enormous amounts, and so we see this spectacle, these different arts. One advantage I think the Ukrainians have had, they know Soviet war making and post-Soviet war making better than the Soviets know their war making, or the post-Soviets know their war making.
So it would seem.
Yeah, but the other thing is, we're seeing the emergence of a new world order, where Putin and Xi Jinping, who had been increasingly mutually cooperative on economic and resource issues, especially natural gas and access to forestry and that, they seem to be forming a bloc, but a very edgy one, and one with a lot of frictions in it, like Central Asia. Who knows how that's going to work? Sure. And because Putin has cast hungry eyes, especially in northern Kazakhstan, that's largely Russian-speaking, and then in East Asia. And then the U.S. is getting more and more involved, or Zelensky's getting more and more involved with the powers. In this slide, we see him with Rishi Sunak, who also needs a little bit of polishing of his image. Zelensky has spoken to every parliamentary assembly in the NATO constellation, and done so with great effectiveness and persuasiveness, and has served as a surprisingly effective president, certainly countered anybody's expectations. And this alleged Nazi is also Jewish in a country that does not have the most attractive history for the treatment of its Jewish population. So
it's turned a corner.
It really has. Now, the long-term prospects and what's going to happen, who knows? Right now, I don't see any possibility for a peace that will be acceptable to either side. Any peace there's going to be has to be guaranteed at least by China and the United States. And in some ways, especially in the light of what we've seen with Secretary Blinken the last couple of days, and we're seeing signs of a thaw, I can't help thinking there's a reactivation of an old, what I call the Kissinger gambit, is that if you can create a three-axis power arrangement, right? You can play both ends against the middle, and it can shift, and it shifts contextually. You might find some sort of modus vivendi, but in terms of a peace, I can't see any peace that isn't by definition temporary, and both sides pulling up. The best I can see for Ukraine is that they might have to give up some territory, but they get entry into the EU, and they get a guarantee of their territorial integrity post Balaam. But we can only hope. Right now, people are just too divided, and the tempers, the anger is too high. Putin is still seeking revanche for the collapse of an empire that he'd grown up in. as are many in his generation and later They're trying to create it through education in Russian schools. And Ukrainians are unified, but what happens after the war with them?
David MacDonald, we have a good idea now how we got here.
Yeah.
And the miscalculations here and there, and the cultures and the history shared and otherwise. And it's been a pleasure.
Always a pleasure, Norman. Thanks so much.
I'm Norman Gilliland, and I hope you can join me next time around for University Place Presents.